Welcome to another episode of What's Your Evidence? I'm your host, Dr. Chris White, professor of history and evidence enthusiast. Today's topic is all about artificial intelligence. And we have just the guest to help us through this question. Dr. John Gibbs is a professor at the University of Georgia, and he has a YouTube channel called Dr. Know-It-All. And my program is all about promoting an evidence-based worldview. And you do this quite well when you look at artificial intelligence in a variety of ways. And this is a topic about which most people, including myself, are well behind the curve. And so, welcome to the show.
Right. Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. This is great. I think we've been trying to set it up for about a month now, so this is fantastic that we finally made it happen. So cool.
Yeah, me too. And I'm glad you were willing to take the time out to us. I know you're very busy with your company and also with being a professor and also having your YouTube channel. And so we have a lot of things that we can talk about. Is there an elevator pitch that's useful for explaining AI?
I hate to say this, but when people ask me about AI, they're like, what are you doing in AI? And I'm like, I'm trying to take your job. I think that's probably, and I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, which, I do a lot of that and people take it very seriously. But I think that people underestimate pretty drastically the sea change that is currently happening. And it was not so obvious even 2 years ago, but I think that even the regular layperson is beginning to hear about things like DALL-E 2 and ChatGPT, and a lot of students are using it. By the by, as a professor,
I've heard about this.
Yeah, I asked. I'm teaching a writing class this spring with 30 students in it, which is twice as big as it's supposed to be. But anyway, I just on January 7th, the day that we started school back, I said, how many people have heard about or used ChatGPT? And half the class raised their hand. And I was like, wow. So the youngsters, they know. And there's a lot of teachers in high school and college right now that are freaking out about ChatGPT. In fact, I think it was either yesterday or the day before that Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, there were people who were saying, please stop this. And he basically said, look, the genie's out of the bottle at this point. You're going to have to figure it out. He said, we learned to deal with calculators. We learned, you test. I don't know. You're not as old as I am. I think you're about 10 years younger than me. But when I grew up, calculators were not. I actually had a calculator, and it was a way of cheating somewhat because nobody else in high school had one. So I could use it because nobody knew what the heck it was, and I would use it on the tests, and it would help me a lot with doing the math quickly. But anyway, so
yeah.
Sorry, folks.
No, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, but as calculators became popular in the 80s and 90s, then high school teachers in particular, but also college faculty, had to learn to test different things. It wasn't just, can you multiply or divide these big numbers, which used to be sufficient for a test. And now you don't test that anymore. My 15-year-old son, has a graphing calculator and of course a Chromebook as well. And so, he can knock out the math like nobody's business. And so I think that Sam is right. This is a much bigger change than a calculator, but it also is something that we just have to get used to, and we're going to have to figure out a way to work with it as opposed to trying to fight it.
Yeah, I thought about that with ChatGPT too, because most of what I assign students has to do with essays and research papers, and so we're just going to have to be a little bit more creative in the kinds of questions that we're asking students and the type of research that we want them to do.
And I think at this point, at least, so my class is a creative writing class, and I said, look, because there are tools out there that you can, like, if you give the same prompt and you say, here's the rubric, here's the prompt, and here's the history, like Napoleonic War, tell me about the Battle of Waterloo, and you ask a very specific question, you could probably determine if that was ChatGPT. But I'm teaching a screenwriting class, and the prompt is basically write a screenplay. So, there is no way if I'm going to know whether somebody's cheated or not. So it's one of those, like, yeah, you can try to be regressive about it, but I think it's going to be much more beneficial to say, how can we learn to utilize this tool? Maybe it can help inspire you. Maybe it can actually write a draft. One of the things about ChatGPT, I don't know, have you used it very much or not?
Just once. Just once.
Oh, okay. So when you do it, I'll say, like, I had one thing. Oh gosh, I can't remember, but I said something about, like, give me a funny anecdote about this person, and it wrote me back with complete confidence and said, like, Yeah, he once got Jay Leno to give him a car on the Tonight Show, and I said, "Wow!" And then I went googling it, and I was like, I can't find any evidence. And then I went back and I asked ChatGPT. I said, "Did you make this up?" And it said, "This is just a hypothetical," but
Ah,
it didn't specify that anywhere. So this is the kind of thing where if somebody said do something on the Battle of Waterloo, and it's like Napoleon came riding in on a rocket ship or something, it would say it with complete confidence that that was correct. So I think that even if you use it as a tool, there's going to be that human like, I should probably check this to make sure that this is actually accurate information. Same thing as using something like Wikipedia, which often has some mistakes in it. So, that kind of
I,
a thing.
it occurs to me because you said we should really try to learn how to use this as opposed to trying to come up with an assignment that forces them to do it on their own. Maybe what we could do is say, okay, we want you all have to use ChatGPT, and then you have to show me what the computer came up with, and then come up with your own so that we can tell the difference between the two, or tell me what you
Right.
learned from what the ChatGPT engine gave you.
Yeah. 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 I have a friend here who's a faculty member in marketing, and he's using ChatGPT and Dolly 2 to do ad stuff. He's like, how fast can we churn out ad copy and ad images? So he's like, what about using this to scale things so that instead of taking weeks or months to come up with an ad campaign, you could do it in an afternoon, right? Because
Yeah.
you could knock out all of these iterations of it really, really fast instead of having to have teams of people working on it. You can just do it by yourself quickly. So, so
Wow.
that's a creative way to utilize the tools at hand to make a step change in your ability to to create ads in this particular case. So
Yeah,
yeah.
kind of like brainstorming and feedback loops too. I mean,
Right.
that it seems like that it could really help in that sense. Huh. I like that. Well, and that kind of brings me to the next thing too, because I know they've heard about artificial intelligence, and I should say too, when I talk to people about how I'm trying to learn about this myself, I get mixed responses from people, as I'm sure you do too. And generally, people will say things like, "It really scares me," or they say the word China, and they kind of associate Chinese intelligence and spying with AI and how it's going to overcome us. And so there's this fear associated with it, but there's also people who are ignorant of it, and then there's people who are embracing it and trying to learn about it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, we've had computers for a long time that have taken over many human tasks. So, what's different about artificial intelligence today?
Hmm. Okay. That is a really big question. So the answer is kind of like yes and no, honestly. In some ways, AI is no different than any other tool we've had, at least in the electronic realm.
Hmm.
Um, so if you want to go back to the calculator example, it's a very, very, very fancy calculator. Um, and honestly, at heart, that's all it is. It just does multiplies and adds. So it really is just a
Hmm.
calculator at heart. But I think so. And I looked at. I didn't have a chance to read Larson's book that you sent me that link, and I'm gonna have to put it on audiobooks and because I never have time to read anymore. But
Oh,
at least when
sure.
I'm driving, I can listen to it. It looks fascinating, but he was like, these things are absolutely never going to think like us and all of this. And I will get into that later. But currently, the one thing you can definitely say about anything that's computer based is it has no agency. It doesn't care. So, right, it's a tool in the sense that a hammer is a tool, or a screwdriver is a tool, or a computer, spreadsheet like Microsoft Excel or something is a tool. So you use it, and it's what you want to get out of it that you're going to get out of it. So you are the person who has the agency, and you tell it what to do, and it operates as a tool. But the day that would be scary, and I don't know if the day will ever come, but the day that would be scary is when the thing goes, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave, right? From like 2001, when it's deciding things and making agency. And I told somebody this once, and of course we can also talk about Tesla, but it said, your car actually does do that already to some extent. And I thought, that's
Hmm.
really interesting, because it will. You'll try to do something, and it'll say like, you're going to drive off the road, or you're going to hit the car in front of you or something. And so there is some agency that it's taking at this point, very primitive, but that does start to like tail into that thing of where it no longer is a tool. Now, okay, so that's the reason why it's the same as everything else. The reason why it's different is I kind of chalk it up to complexity. what it's doing at heart is really, really simple. And it's super easy to understand if you look at 2 or 3 neurons, artificial neurons. Um, but when you look at 175 billion, or the next generation is going to be in the tens of trillions of parameters, I like it. And the reason why I kind of take issue with Larson, even though I haven't read the book yet, and so I need to
Yeah.
do that before I really dig into it. But I really believe that the human brain it's an emergent property of complexity. That's my personal belief. That's it's not as scientifically based as things should be, so it's a hypothesis, I guess, at this point. But anyway, I think that anything that gets complex enough will actually emergently create some form of proto-consciousness. So there is a big difference between computers and humans, which is the computers are effectively immortal, at least on the short time span of human life, that they can last a lot longer than humans because they can just keep copying themselves to new hardware all the time, and humans can't at this point. So that's a fundamental difference. But I think that what we're seeing out of neural networks in particular is an emergence of behavior that's sort of unexpected. The quality of that behavior is unexpected because the emergent property is, again, I think, just like the human brain or a dog's brain or a bacteria's brain or whatever, it's like you get complex behavior that just comes from the amount of complexity involved in whatever the brain is, or brain analog in the case of a computer.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
speaking
very
of
different.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, and speaking of a brain analog, and you mentioned neurons before. Can you talk about what a neural network is?
sure. So, okay. So the way, not to go too much into detail because it doesn't really follow the biology of the human brain, but basically a neuron inside of your brain is, if it gets enough energy put into one end, it then triggers something where it fires and it says like, okay, I'm going to fire down a signal, and that goes to the next, to the next neuron through synapses and things. So the same thing effectively is done in the computer. And this has been done since the 1950s, by the way. This was one of the very first artificial intelligence things that was done. It was just that you couldn't do 175 billion parameters, and you didn't have access to trillions of words on the internet and things like that back in the 1950s. So, it kind of has gone through phases of development. But at heart, it takes in. So if you have 3 inputs into one neuron, the neuron is just call it like a sum. It's just an additive little thing. It's just sitting there. So again, you can think about a cell in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, and you have 3 cells that feed into it, and you've got like, maybe you have like a sum function. So you're like, add these 3 cells together. So this one's -1, this one's 2, this one's 0.5 something. You add them together, and then you have, the critical part is you have a nonlinear threshold. So within that cell, you're saying, based on a sigmoid function, which is just kind of an S curve, or a rectified linear unit, or something like that, something that's nonlinear, if it meets a threshold, if that number that you've summed together meets a threshold, and usually you have to multiply it by weights and all of that stuff, but just to keep this simple, if
Hmm.
that meets a threshold, then you pass on a signal to the next step in the process, the next neuron. If it doesn't meet that threshold, you just stay quiet. And so that's, I think, as simple as you can make it, but basically that just means you're multiplying weights times input values. You're then adding that stuff together, and you're making a decision about whether to pass the signal on to the next element, the next layer in the neural network. And that's why a lot of people just call it a giant multiply and add. It's a dot product, actually. So
Okay.
if you're used to linear algebra, and you have like matrices that you're multiplying together, then what you're doing is you're multiplying each of the rows, or sorry, you multiply each element in the row, and then you add the rows up, and then what you're doing is you're acting on the result of that thing with a nonlinear function. So
Okay. And how is this making AI more powerful?
well, like I said, right, it really is kind of crazy that it does. It's a nutty thing, because at heart, one of these is so simple to understand, and you're like, yeah, no big deal. I think the way that it makes it powerful is the next step that I didn't talk about yet, which is the alteration of the weights. So you've got something that's coming in, and then you've got things sitting in these cells, which are just numbers, right? So it could be 5, it could be 1.2, it could be 27 or something. So you've got these numbers that are being multiplied by that. It's how you change those numbers that is the critical part. And essentially what you're doing, again, this is where somewhat more complex math comes in, at least
Yeah.
theoretically speaking, but you do a gradient descent. And so what you do is you look at the partial derivative of you. So you look at your error. And if you have an error, then what you do is you back propagate it through everything, and you decide every single weight that you've got on this whole thing, you decide what is your responsibility? How much are you responsible for the mistake that was made? That's essentially what's going on. And so by figuring out how much each of these things are responsible for that mistake, you then say, okay, so you're responsible this much, go the opposite direction that much. And then usually there's the thing called a learning rate. So you multiply it by like 0.1 or 0.01. So it doesn't make really big steps. It makes little baby steps in the direction. So what you're looking for is you're looking for the error direction, and then you're turning around and going the opposite way a little bit. And so over time, with enough data and enough things, you keep refining those numbers until they get really, really good at predicting whatever it is. So a picture of a dog versus a cat or something like that is a kind of my classic example. I always use that, right? So you have a 1,000 pictures of dogs and 1,000 pictures of cats, and you know the answer already, right? Because you feed this thing the 2,000 images. And when it gets to the end, at the beginning, it's just flipping a coin. It's like cat, and you're like, no, dog. And then it's like dog, and you're like, no, cat. And then you're like dog, and it's like, yes, that is a dog. So just randomly doing this, but after thousands and thousands and thousands of training cycles, it begins to figure out how to tune all of these little numbers, all of these weights, so that when you feed it a picture of a cat that it has never seen before, it's going to be very probably likely to produce a cat, the output of a cat.
So is that what's meant by training a neural network?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So, and the training part, one thing to know, and one thing that's really interesting about neural networks as opposed to a lot of coding, this is a major difference between a neural network and a calculator, is that neural networks only deal with probabilities. So the output you get, even though the computer, the architecture might go cat, it might think that's a cat at 67% confidence, and it might think it's a dog at 33% confidence. What it presents to you is cat, and you're like, cool, that looks like a cat. You're right. But what you're not seeing under the hood, unless you open it up and look inside, is the probability. And so what you want, of course, is to push that probability. If you have cats, you want to push that probability towards 1, but it's never going to be 1.0. It's always going to be some fraction less than 100%.
And how well networked is AI right now? In other words, how much connection does something like ChatGPT have to the internet? Can it access it like Google can, for example?
No.
Okay.
I think they've explicitly done that. I believe it was August of 2021 when they stopped, something along those lines. It's somewhere in 2021 that they basically took the internet up until then, and they stopped. And so if you ask it a current event question, for example, something about the Ukraine war that's going on right now, it won't know that because it has not seen that before. So it doesn't have access to that information. I haven't tried it. I mean,
historians might be screwed in that sense too, because we don't really cover stuff that's happening right now. But although I helped teach a class on the Ukraine war over the summer, and so we were looking at the historical context of what's happening today.
Yeah, so it could probably give you a lot of that information.
Yeah,
but it wouldn't necessarily know. Now, GPT-4 that's coming out very, very soon, that has access to more current data. So, and then I think Google, what is the name of their competing product? They've got it's not Sparrow. Anyway, I can't remember the name of their product.
Yeah,
but they're coming out with one too, and I think that one actually has active connection to the internet, which is a little bit more terrifying.
Right, because the thing that I think of, I'm sure you think of it too, is that if it's connected to the internet, then it could probably connect to things that could actually harm us too.
Well, I mean, I would hope it would be a one-way connection where it's just a consumer of the internet, not
not something that would trigger nuclear war or something like that.
Hopefully we're not going to end up, what was that movie, War Games with Matthew Broderick? Yeah.
Would you like to play a game?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's where my mind went too. Right. Yeah, War Games, and that's in the early 80s, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we're not. I hope that these researchers, these companies, aren't stupid enough to do that. That would be a mistake. I think most of them pretty harsh, they significantly sandbox these things.
Okay, well, and that's reassuring too, because the idea that people oftentimes people are afraid of something if they don't really understand it, right? So the idea
Right.
that they go to the Terminator scenario or the War Games scenario, then it
Right.
really comes back to, as you said, it's a tool and it's made by humans too,
Right.
and so it's
Right.
supposed to be used by humans. So do you
Right.
have, I mean, is there part of your brain that kind of speculates and is concerned about some type of worst case scenario with this?
The biggest concern that I have is less about, triggering global thermonuclear war. I think humans are going to be really good at that. So if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be us.
Oh, good point.
But yeah, not that I hope we do that. That would be a horrible mistake.
Yeah,
But I think the bigger issue is disruption to just jobs. I
yeah,
hate to say it, but both of us are in danger. Anybody who's designing graphic art right now is in very much danger. I have a lot of former students who are artists and digital artists, and I'm seeing a lot of rumbling from them on the internet about how they think this is unfair, and they really dislike the generative nature of AI stuff. And it's because I think at heart that there's a fear that, you spend, gosh, to become a good artist like that, it's decades, right? You
yeah,
start somewhere around 10 years old or so, maybe seriously, and you're working till your 20s, 30s, and et cetera, and that's suddenly you have an AI that could potentially replace that. That's terrifying. So
yeah.
I think job replacement is the biggest concern that I have at this
Okay.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, if we go to some of the kind of exciting things that are happening, especially with Tesla, can you talk about how the idea of neural networks is connected to what Tesla's doing?
Oh yeah. That's at the so just because you have a different audience, of course, the audience that I usually have on my YouTube channel is like, I don't have to give them the preamble,
Yeah.
but Tesla is of course a car company. They also have 8 cameras currently on every single automobile that they have. And they have some combination of ultrasonics and radar and stuff like that, although the most recent versions of their cars only have the cameras. So we can just deal with the visual aspect and not worry about the rest of it. Anyway, those 8 cameras are taken in by a computer on the car. They are worked through all of
Mm,
the little tiny bits of data, right? So every single pixel on every single camera is 3 values. It's three 0 to 1 values, or 0 to 255, depending on how you want to do it. But it's RGB, right? So you've got red, green, blue. So your background's kind of a teal color. So it's going to have a pretty high blue value, probably a pretty high green value, maybe some red, something like that, right? So every single one of those pixels then gets taken in, and then the computer inside, using neural network architecture, which is incredibly, profoundly complicated to do. I don't know how they manage this, but they turn that into essentially a video game. So as you're driving down the road, it turns these reddish pixels and things like that with shiny spots and stuff into a car. And it's like, there's a car, it's that far away from you, it's going the same direction as you, so I'm going to ignore it because we're driving together. And then it's like, here's another one that's coming from the side that's like, maybe I need to brake for because it might be stupid and cut me off or something. And here's the side of the road, and here's the surface of the road, and there's some trees over there, but I can ignore those because that's trees and that's like, not in my path. So that's what it's doing, is it's interpreting the entire world through neural networks using this vision system. And then the downstream end of that, so that's the inference of the world and understanding it. And then there's what's called a policy network, and the policy network decides what to do with that. So with a car, it's actually pretty simple, right? It's like you can turn left or right, and you can brake or you can accelerate. That's pretty much it. So there's basically 3 controls, and so the policies are relatively straightforward in terms of controlling the vehicle. Not I, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have said that, but it's, a thing that people have worked on for a long time, and they've pretty much got that part down. So the big part of it is understanding the world. And if you think about us humans, driving the car, we're pretty decent at that. After a year of driving, you've got it down. You can pretty much turn the wheel, accelerate, decelerate, all of that stuff. Mostly where humans have problems is when we're looking at our cell phones or looking out the window or talking to the kids in the back seat or something. That's the problems when we get distracted. So again, with these neural networks, the more complicated task is understanding the world. And that's where neural networks are just there. This was not true 5 years ago. They had a lot of hard-coded C, C++, things like that, that were making decisions kind of like, if you see this, then do this. If you see this, then do this. And that was making up this world out of that. But they've transitioned pretty much entirely to neural network architectures at this point, specifically using transformers as the architecture that they use now.
And so you drive a Tesla, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And can you think of any times when when that capability, its artificial intelligence, has saved your life or possibly someone else's?
I think it's kind of, I'm not tooting my own horn, but I'm a very, very, very aware driver, like hyper aware.
Yeah.
So I think there have been cases where it has reacted about as fast or a little bit faster than me. So I'll see somebody cut me off and I'll go to hit the brakes and the car will already be doing it. So, but if I was distracted, right? If I turned around for a second to talk to my kid in the back seat, then it would have. And there's many, many people I know that say that has happened. So in terms of moment to moment safety, it's really excellent. It's not perfect by any means. It makes mistakes. I just actually posted a video this morning, like right before we recorded this, that there was a new version of the full self-driving beta out, and I was testing it, and I came on an unprotected left-hand turn, which is, people, it's 55, so people were driving 65, of course, but they come over the top of a hill, and I have to make a turn into another street without having really good visibility and with people coming at you really fast. And the car kind of went out a little bit, and then these people came over the rise, and instead of stopping, which is what it should have done, it kind of was like, oh, I'll just keep on going. And so I had to punch it to get across the road. So that's the kind of thing where it's not, it's not perfect yet. In hindsight, I think it probably would have made it across the road into the other road without those cars hitting it, but I was not going to, at 65 miles an hour, I am not going to be testing that out. I do not want to find out, so anyway, the big thing at that point was I talked about the policy network and the control network. And even though I said that it's pretty much a solved problem, it's not completely. And they're talking about, I believe, the next major revision of the software is going to have neural networks in the policy network as opposed to hard-coded stuff. And it should hopefully resolve some of those issues, because one of the problems right now is when it goes, it's kind of hesitant. And, a human, you're like, if I'm going, I'm going, right? When you make that decision, hesitation kills, right? I think that's like a classic line. So, as a human being, you're like, if I'm going to do this, I better do it and get across the road so these people don't hit me. And I think that the new policy networks that will be put in place should help resolve some of those issues, because it should be able to act a little more human. Remember when I said probabilistic? One of the things about the real world is it's incredibly fuzzy and probabilistic. You look like a human being to me on the camera right now, but if you added a whole bunch of noise to it and went way back or something, or the camera got really dark, there would come a time when I'd be like, is that a person or not? I can't really tell anymore.
Oh, sure.
And so everything is probabilities in the real world. You're not dealing with absolutes, which is something computers have been really, really good at absolutes. If you're playing a game, one of the reasons why computers have done excellently at games is that most games have 100% type rules, right? Checkers or chess or tic-tac-toe or whatever, these things have rules, and they're very, very clear rules. And even something as complicated as something like Mario Kart or Nintendo games or things, they have very clear rules. If you do this combination of moves, you're going to pick up the power up and shoot the turtle at the next guy in front of you. And, so computers can figure that stuff out because it's very, very clear. But the real world, that's one of the complexities. One of the reasons why AI has not been as effective in the real world up until now is just that the real world is so fuzzy.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I was, well, I remember seeing something about how with stop signs, especially because there's different kinds of stop signs around the world, that they're just taking all these different pictures of stop signs so they can recognize them. And I was wondering, well, how would it react if it saw a mural that had a stop sign on it that was supposed to be at a crosswalk, for example, nearby there? And of course, it would be off of the road enough that it probably wouldn't mistake it, right?
In earlier versions, it definitely did.
Yeah.
There would be things like, they just take a billboard or something where it's like, stop, buckle your seatbelt or just something, whatever.
Oh
But,
yeah.
a picture of a guy holding up a stop sign and it would break. I still have those problems. Once in a while, it's better. So if you're driving down a road and there's another road that impinges on your road, but it's like not at 90 degrees, let's say it's only like 60 or 70 degrees. So you've got a little bit of that stop sign you can see because it's tilted towards you.
Mm.
Oftentimes as the car approaches that, it like doesn't fully brake, but it kind of slows down. You can see it going like, is that a stop sign I need to pay attention to or not? Because it's like over there, it's also turned that way, but maybe that's for me. So,
Yeah. Do you think at all that that this, I mean, this is just a question that occurred to me just now, but I mean, I heard about a study one time by a Purdue professor of engineering that they basically found that people who have the safest cars, knowing they have the safest cars, this is before Tesla, that they tend to drive less safely. So do you think, and I don't know if it's true or not, right? But if you have seatbelts and you have airbags and all that kind of stuff, then you might be a little bit more complacent. But do you think there's any danger that people are kind of going to lose that gray matter in their heads over time
Oh
to
yeah.
really be careful about this
Oh yeah,
when they're driving?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I've had full self-driving for about 16 months now, and I'm definitely not as good a driver as I was before.
Yeah.
Especially not so much around city driving because those are short bursts, but when I go on a road trip and I drive for 10 or 12 hours, I now depend on the car a lot. It's
Yeah.
really, really, really good on highways. Highways are relatively simple because everybody's going the same direction about the same speed, and generally speaking, there's not red lights and things like that. But I when I have to drive, because we do have another car that doesn't have full self-driving, and I'm like, man, this
Yeah.
sucks.
I bet. I
Yeah,
just think about
but
the
yeah,
London cab drivers who they say, they have this really big area because they have to learn the whole,
right,
everything in London,
right.
right? And so, but they always point out how their gray area right there, their gray matter associated with that diminishes within a short of period of time that they stop their
Right.
work too, than when they
Yeah.
retire.
Well, okay, so let's go back to the education system 150 years ago, which was learn Latin and learn multiplication tables. And that was literally memorize this word, memorize this word, memorize this sentence, memorize what 2 times 17 is, that kind of stuff. So we don't do that anymore because we have things that do it for us, which means that our gray matter, like people's memorization ability is far less than it used to be.
Hmm.
It just has to be because we don't utilize that anymore. But it's also really not necessary because what we've done is we've offloaded all of that onto phones and computers and things like that. So we're able to do things that are more fun than just memorizing. I would hope that the education world right now is a lot more interesting than it was back in those days where you had the person with the ruler smacking your hand if you didn't answer
Yeah.
the question fast enough. Pretty boring just memorizing facts.
That's
So
a great way of putting it too, because
yeah,
you probably heard this before too, but I hear from so many people, oh my gosh, look how much smarter they were back in the old days because
right,
they show a test from 1908 of everything people had to know about grammar and mathematics. But then I say, yeah, but most people didn't know about germ theory back then either. They're not focusing
right,
on the things. We don't need those things anymore because we can outsource it. It's kind of like
right.
when we evolved from primitive primates. We outsourced a lot of our digestion to the cooking pot, and we don't need to spend all day long digesting fibrous materials like the apes
Right.
do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look at a lion or an ape or something. They spend a lot of time sleeping that we don't have to do because they have to digest all of their food. So,
Yeah,
yeah. I
definitely.
mean, fire was a pretty impressively important technology in terms of pre-digest. I like thinking about it that way. You're pre-digesting your food
Yeah,
externally.
yeah. Of course,
Um,
I took that idea from Michael Pollan. That's how he phrases it,
yeah.
and who got it from a Harvard professor too. But I love that way. It's kind of like that's what we're constantly doing is trying to find ways. Like Václav Smil, historian of energy, is talking about. Really, it's all that's what life is pursuing ways of getting more energy and getting more out of it too.
Right. Right. Yeah. I
And
mean, the fact that we're able to sit here and have a conversation rather than be looking for food is a pretty major, and that we have the technology to be able to communicate across what 500 or 600 miles,
yeah.
right? All of these pieces are like, wow, that's pretty amazing that we're able to do that and not be hunting and gathering food right now.
And there's big
So
implications for that too. I remember, in Viktor Frankl's book, he talks about how his patients in the 1940s and 50s had this problem. So many of them just couldn't find meaning in life, right?
mm,
And
mm,
and it occurs to me so much of this has to do with, basically in the past 100 years, ever since the invention of artificial fertilizers and all these technologies, most people just kind of have to invent how to spend their days and how to find meaning as opposed to
right,
hunting and gathering and farming and things like that, which would provide meaning, even though it might be depressing. And so
right,
we kind of have to come up with ways of spending our time and also finding value in our day-to-day lives.
right.
Do you have any sense of how AI might change that?
Well, it's going to put more pressure on humans because again, so this is just one particular outcome. I know you had in the questions the singularity,
Yeah.
which but so let's just project forward and say 15 years from now, AI has taken over 90% of human labor. Like it can do most. So if we have bots that can go out and pick stuff for us and grow things for us, and we have really, really smart computers that can do most of the creative work and knowledge-based work that we need, then that leaves humans. Hopefully, what will happen is we'll get some sort of universal basic income that
Mm,
everybody will just have. But then a lot of people, especially in the United States, we're really good at this and identifying ourselves, our personal worth with our jobs. I think there are a lot of other countries that are not quite so crazy about that. But anyway,
yeah.
so if you suddenly don't have a job, what is it that you fill your day with? What does give you meaning? So I think that is going to put pressure on humanity to
Yeah.
try to come up with that.
Gosh. I would just think about things like supply and demand, like with art. You did a recent one about there's a court case, right, where they're trying to sue an AI.
Right.
Was that the Dali 2, or was that
It
something
was
else?
no, I think that they picked no, they specifically didn't pick OpenAI, and I think it's because they're backed by Microsoft. So
Sure.
I think they're just being smart. But Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, and Deviant Art, I think those were the three that they picked. So they're smaller, but it's the same technology. More or less. I know there's differences. Just for people, just like don't yell at me. I know they're different and they're not exactly
Yeah.
the same. But anyway, yeah. but but um but there's a fundamental misunderstanding in that lawsuit, which is that they say this is a collage technology. So, if you think about Photoshop, you can take like a picture of Elon Musk and a picture of whoever and a picture of somebody, and you can cut their heads out and put them on like people riding horses like cowboys. And, that would be collaging something. You're taking other people's art and you're making it your own. And even that's protected under fair usage if you make enough changes. But the problem is that's not what's going on here. This is you're saying generate an image of Elon Musk with a cowboy hat riding a cowboy in Utah or something, right? You type that in, and what happens is it's multiplying and adding a whole bunch of times, like billions and billions of times, and outputting something. It's not collaging anything. That's a creative act on the part of the computer.
Wow.
So yeah, and people really don't understand that. This
Yeah.
is not Photoshop. This is like having a person and saying to that person, do this for me, and they do it. Now, it's not perfect at it because of course this is very early days. And a lot of times it'll have 18 fingers on somebody's hand and stuff. So it's kind of laughable sometimes, but it's like, holy crap, what is it going to be like in another year or two?
And so, do you think that kind of artificial intelligence art production is going to possibly compete with people who can produce art that could be, potentially worth lots of money? Is that what
Oh
the
yeah.
concern is? Yeah.
It already does. That there's a
Okay.
major shift that's already happening. Now, I think what you're thinking about is somebody like Banksy, who's like a famous artist or something. I think to some extent those people are protected because a lot of the value of their art is just, I don't know, fine art is a weird world.
Yeah.
A
Sure.
lot of the value of their art is because it's them that did it, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if I was skilled enough to make something that looked like a Banksy painting, then people aren't going to pay any money for it because they don't care. So if the AI does something, which you can do, you can say, give me something that looks like a Banksy painting, and it will do it, but it's worth nothing. The danger is to people, they're just the regular folks out there who have a job doing graphic design or doing art for advertisements or doing things like that. Those people are the ones who make a decent amount of money, and companies are going to go, wait a second. Instead of having a shop with 10 of these artists, we can have one person oversee the AI and
Oh,
make sure
yeah.
that it's doing right. And so that changes. You lose 9 people's jobs just like that in one company. It's gone.
Wow.
So that's what I'm talking about, taking your jobs. When I said right at the beginning of what we were talking about, that's what I
Yeah.
mean. And it's terrifying. And the two of us are in trouble too. There is going to come a time, and it won't be that far away, when people are going to go, wait, AI is way better at teaching than humans are.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you imagine, like I just said, I had 30 people in one class, and that's like, I'd prefer to have 15, but trying to teach those 30 people, as opposed to having, if they had a laptop that was just an AI that did what I did, but it was just them. And it was
Yeah.
just one to one to one. And it was like, how can I best orient the learning outcomes for you individually? And it had the time and capacity and patience to do that. Because, as a human being, sometimes we also get impatient. We're like, oh my gosh, how slow can you be? Right. It's
Yeah.
like, pick it
Right.
up, pick it up. So anyway, um, so yeah, I think that anybody in the knowledge field is in big trouble. Like, we
Wow.
could be replaced faster than people who are doing manual labor, because robotics has not made nearly as much progress as artificial intelligence has. Not to be depressing to everybody, sorry,
Sure.
but
Sure.
that's what keeps me up at night. I mean, that keeps me up at night thinking about that. I really, really worry about it.
Wow. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I have a lot of thoughts on that too. It makes me think that we're going to have to kind of compete with them for almost for entertainment value in a way. Like just like with these famous artists, people don't want to buy a knockoff of Van Gogh
right,
or a Degas or a Dali or something like that, but because they find a lot of meaning in the experience of knowing that they're in the presence of that beauty, kind of like at the Dali Museum down
right,
in Florida too. So hopefully that we won't be entirely replaced, but I can
right,
certainly see that as a threat.
right. Yeah, but the other way to think about it, and there's kind of two ways to approach the future. One is trying to hold it back, and the other one is
Uh,
to embrace it and say, how can we make this work for us? This is not the first. You being a historian know all about the Luddites, and
yeah,
and this is not the first time that a technology has come in and terrified people. And so humans are really, really good at adapting and becoming skilled at things that we weren't skilled at before. There were no nuclear physicists back when the Luddites were having their revolution. So there's a
yeah.
whole new industry of people that didn't even exist as a thing before. So that there are things that will open up too, I
Yeah,
hope.
that's what I was thinking too. Right, exactly. I mean, just because new technologies come along, then doesn't mean that everybody's out of work back then either. I mean,
Right,
people have
right,
to adapt, but we still are faced with that issue. Like, for example, we're in coal country here, as you
right,
know, and so you have people who stay behind because they're really hoping for some type of revival, or they connected to the place, and a lot of them end up being on public assistance. And then you have people who move
right.
to the cities, and you see this urbanization taking place, the rural to urban migration that's been taking place, especially ever since the Industrial Revolution began. So there's something
Right.
probably similar that could happen, maybe not
Yeah,
geographically as much, but with this too.
right. But I don't know. I actually, this is just totally off the cuff. I have no proof
Yeah,
for any of this, but I actually wonder if COVID in some ways might have a little bit of a silver lining to it, which is maybe it will slow down the urbanization a little bit. Because if one of the reasons people urbanize is to be close to other people, to be able to do work in person at a specific place. And I could see people going like, well, look, if I don't have to be there in person, my wife works entirely remotely. Her company's out of Florida, you know, so
yeah,
we didn't have to move to Florida, and we didn't have to have the conversation of, are you going to give up your job, or am I going to give up my job? And we're, to go there or something. Um, so there are some interesting new possibilities of being able to do things more, remotely and distributedly.
yeah. Right. Yeah. Things. Well, that's one thing about history is it's not static. People think that it
Right.
is, but really, and change happens so rapidly. And
Right.
and of course, that gets you mentioned the singularity. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, I think Ray Kurzweil was the first person who brought that up. I could be wrong about that, but I think he was the person. But I think a lot of people, so a lot of people know about like black holes, and there's a mathematical singularity there because gravity is essentially infinite. But essentially, especially in AI, a singularity is a choke point in history where you don't really know what the outcome's going to be after that. I think that's the broadest way to put it. So if you think about AI, there's a lot of advances happening right now, and we're getting to a point where it's compressing. And I don't, if you have a boring period of time, I don't know if history is ever boring, but
Yeah.
maybe there's a period of time where nothing happens for a few decades or something like that significantly. You can sort of follow the threads and you can see where it's going. But when all the threads start coming together and get tangled up, you get to a choke point, which was what Kurzweil at least is defining as the singularity. And after that point, you don't have good. It's like your weather forecasting. You can weather forecast pretty well for the next 10 years if it's really stable and everything's just kind of going along at this sedate pace. That is not what's happening right now. Things are really going like this, and you can't weather forecast what the future is going to look like after that point. So it's not a bad or a good or anything. It's just a we don't know thing. And I'm trying to remember when he predicted, I think he said like 2030-ish.
Hmm.
And I saw an interview that he did with Lex Friedman recently, and I think he re-upped that. He said he still thinks it's going to be around there when it will happen. So
Yeah, I saw that one too. And this is
yeah.
where kind of artificial intelligence and humans, it's going to be hard to distinguish between the two. Is that what it is? Because
I,
they're kind of combining our minds
well, I
with.
mean, the pessimistic way of looking at it is we'll hit the singularity, and I noticed Larson actually was very explicitly arguing against this, but
Mhm.
that AI will go from stupid, 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 maybe like a frog or something, maybe a dog, and then up to a monkey, and then up to a really dumb human, and then boom, it'll just be past humans like that, like
Right.
accelerated past us,
I
and that
see.
the singularity will happen because not because you won't be able to tell the difference, but because AI will be so much more intelligent than humans at that point. And that's a completely arguable thing, but that is the what a lot of people think about as a singularity. I don't think it has to go that way. I think the singularity can be much more about just when we intertwine all of these threads. So previously, creative art and engineering and like robotics and human anatomy and biochemistry and health. I mean, there's a lot of AI stuff going on with health right now that could effectively make us live forever. It's quite possible that that might happen. Um, so all of these things are happening at the same time, and it just becomes really, really difficult to see what's going to come out of it. So it's less that necessarily AI will become super smart and humans will be like ants and it'll stomp on us,
Mm.
and more like we just don't have a vision. But already there's a good argument to be made that human beings are cyborgs. If you do you have any
Yeah.
kids? I don't know if you do or not, but if
Oh
if
yeah, I
you
have twin boys. Yeah,
yeah, so if you tell them the worst punishment you can give them is to say you're going to take away their cell phone or their internet access or something, right? It's
definitely.
like it's like a limb. It's like saying you're going to cut off their hand or something. So we have become effectively cyborgs already because we've offloaded so much of our data and so much of our interactions and things like that to virtual space.
I buy that, and I'm glad that you brought up also the aspect of medicine too. What I imagine is, whenever we go to a physician, we tell them our symptoms. They do a little exam, but they're really trying to get through things as quickly as they can while it's still giving you good care. What if they could just take all of your symptoms and then search all of the medical journals that are
Right,
available at the NIH at the same time, and then come up with like 5 or 6 different options where they could narrow
right.
it down so they don't
Yeah,
leave anything out. I'm thinking of the case with Lance Armstrong, like 20 years ago or so.
right.
He initially supposedly only had testicular cancer, and then a professor at the University of Indiana got in touch with him, or he got in touch with him, and he said actually a lot of times it's associated with brain cancer, or lung
Right,
cancer or something. It migrates up,
right.
and but that was but he had to do something human. He had to actually
Yeah.
call this person up and talk to him, and then get the modification. Otherwise, he probably would have died of
Right.
brain cancer as a result.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's a good example. I think another like so I don't know that I'm not a doctor in the not the useful kind at least, but let's say that there's a rare disease. Well, my niece actually had a form of cancer that only 3 people in the entire United States had ever had before,
Mm,
and it was like in the roof of her mouth, crazy, crazy stuff. So anyway, the dentist saw it of all things. Um, but anyway, unfortunately they caught it. But it's the kind of thing where if she hadn't gone to the right people who knew the right things and knew the right questions to ask, they could have misdiagnosed that. And if they had, it could have been a very, very, very severe outcome for that. And so if you think about an AI which has access to all medical data from everywhere,
Wow.
even if there's only 5 cases of it in the whole world, and your primary care physician has never even heard of this disease before, the AI can go like, hey, this matches all the symptoms. And this isn't even like super advanced AI, it's just having access to the data. But it could raise its hand and go like, you should probably check this, and maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, could narrow it
Yeah,
down based on, because there's potentially thousands of different things that
right,
somebody could have wrong with
right.
them, or even more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was in grad school for AI, which I did at UGA, one of the things that they did, and this was using really primitive stuff. I mean, it wasn't, we were using, I think it was Prolog that we were actually using. So it wasn't even neural nets or anything, but basically it was a toy data set. And it was like, here's 25 symptoms that you can have, and here's lists of diseases with the symptoms they have. And you can make an AI pretty straightforwardly that will go through that and give you the likely outcome that this disease is going to be based on these symptoms that you
Wow.
have. Yeah. So I mean, so it doesn't take a super advanced. Now, the ones that are coming out right now, super advanced because they're dealing with, millions of cases. If you have a data set that big, this thing's going to fall apart. The one that I worked on, but they can deal with that. They can also do protein folding now. I mean, protein folding, I believe it was one protein fold was one PhD student and $1 million or something along those lines. That's how much it was. And they now it's like basically free. If you want to find out how a specific protein folds, you just ask, and it's just does it for you. So there's like 200,000 folded proteins that have already been discovered, and I'm sure the number is growing.
Wow.
So as we're able to do that, we can start designing drugs, and we can start to look at exactly what's happening with human aging and with specific diseases. And again, I'm not a doctor, so I can't get into that deeply because I don't know that much about the medicine behind it. But that's like a, I've been like super depressing, but this is like really, really good news. This is stuff that could be amazing. And they're already starting to do therapies on people. There was I think she was in the United Kingdom, but anyway, there was a girl that had I think it was a form of cancer that was incurable. They tried everything, and they finally took out her genetic samples and retooled the genes and put them back in again, and she's completely cancer free. Just gone. So
Wow.
yeah, I mean, that's the kind of crazy stuff that we can have access to more and more and more as time goes on.
And it seems like, especially since you said that it's free now with protein folding, and I think that could
Yeah.
translate into other forms of treatment that are out there in the medical field and drugs too. That a big problem that we have right now with things like HIV and hepatitis and tuberculosis is that getting cheap drugs to poor people and
Right.
remote places is a difficult thing. We see this with the COVID vaccine as well. Even though the COVID vaccine is subsidized, by governments and all that, just getting it, transporting it
Dude.
to these places. So they might be able to reduce. Oops. Yeah.
So sorry about that. That would
No,
be
no,
my
no.
my robot vacuum kicked in. I was like,
Oh,
oh
how
gosh.
funny. There you
So
go. There's an
yeah.
example. But it seems like that it could get to a point where this could actually also help the kind of close the medical divide too, especially if it can be produced at a very cheap rate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of those drugs, a lot of them require like refrigeration and very careful care. And so just the ability to make a new drug that's more robust, that you can just, throw in the back of a semi trailer, and it can be 110 degrees inside there and it doesn't matter,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, that kind of thing will make it so much more accessible to remote areas and poorer countries and things like that. So
And I think
yeah.
this relates to my last question here, which is, and there were some other ones that we kind of alluded to that I had as questions, but we talked to about them. And the last question is really, what careers would you advise young people to be working towards? We talk about medicine and pharmaceuticals and treatments, but can you think of some others? So they don't get displaced, so they can have hope in the future.
Yeah, right. I
Yeah.
think that is something that I really have been struggling with, right? As a teacher, that's something that it really, really impacts me because, of course, I want the best outcome for my students. Um, I, I think the best thing you can do strategically is learn the most you can about artificial intelligence. like whether or not that is your thing that you're going to go into, the more that you understand about what it is and how it really works, not just the hype and stuff, but like really understanding it. I would highly recommend Andre Karpathy, who used to be the AI, gosh, I can't remember his exact title. It was the lead of the director of AI at Tesla. Anyway, he retired last year, and he's been putting out videos. He's got a YouTube channel, and they are just excellent. Like they just get into it. You can watch them and not do the programming, but he's like, this is how this works. This is why this works. This is the reason why you get the output you do. And just watching his videos through, it's his last name is Karpathy. So anyway, you know, you look, you can leave a link to it in the description or something like that. But anyway, I highly recommend something like that. Like that's just no hype at all. It's just like, this is how you do it. And I think that will allay your fears, but also let you really start to understand where the big possibilities are for AI, but also where it's not going to go as well, and not as quickly at least. So I think that would be a valid source. A lot of times reading popular press, the problem is you're just going to be like either completely optimistic or super pessimistic, and it's not really giving you a ton of information. But I think especially for younger people who are starting their careers, like finding out about it and how it might impact your industry that you're interested in and how you could utilize it. So instead of being like, we go back to the surfing thing that we talked about, I think before we started recording, but it's like you either ride the wave or you get crushed by it. So, you know, might as well ride it.
Sure, and people have proven adept at adapting to technology changes over time, and there are some historians, and I think they're spot on. You know, each historian kind of focuses on one element that they think adds more change or affects more change than others. There's some that I've read recently that really are focusing on germs as much as possible or the environment, but there's other historians say it really comes down to technology. I mean, yeah, those other things matter, right? But when those technological changes happen, then it's really a threshold event, and we just can't go back from there. And if you just focus on technological advances, I think about things associated with the plow, you know, or fertilizer, or the iPhone, then that's really where the big changes take place in humanity, and everybody else kind of gets swept along.
Yeah, I mean, take a look at just to go back in history 100+ years, look at the horse to car transition. There was a lot of there was a lot of tussle, and just, you know, even to the extent that potentially, you know, there's some of the root causes of World War I, this is really going out on a limb, could have been related to those transitions that were going on at that time. But anyway, you know, if you go back and look at something that happened that long ago, you're like, well, that's obvious that it had to happen, that the car had to be ahead. But there were a lot of people at that time who were like, no, horse. And I think the lesson to be learned is humans don't, like, once we have access to something like Pandora's box, like, you know, if you're like, you open it, it's like you can't close it again. Human nature is not to close that box. It's like, we're like, cool, new toys, we'll take those, thank you. And so we're not going to go backwards.
Well, and that relates also to your channel too, and I think a lot of your videos are kind of like that. You're very enthusiastic about it. It's like, oh, hey, here's this new thing going on. Can you talk about your channel so people can check it out?
Yeah, it's tech focused. A lot of stuff about Tesla, but that's a lot because they are really pushing the boundaries of engineering and artificial intelligence in particular. And I said I did a test drive of the beta software, so I look at that. I have breakdowns of a lot. I try to do explainer videos about somewhat complex topics like transformers, or what a basic neural network is, or how the vision system works on a Tesla. And I've got a bunch of playlists on my channel, so if people are interested, I guess that's if you don't want to dive quite as deep as Andre Karpathy, you can look at my channel and some of the, I have a playlist called Explaining Andre, which is just explaining, because he does some, like, you know, academic talks and stuff, and people are like, what in the world is he saying? So I do a video where I actually break down what he's saying and say, like, this is what he actually means here, for a little bit more layperson audience. So hopefully that would be helpful.
Right on. Well, I've certainly found them helpful. And so if people want to find you, they can just go to YouTube and type in Dr. Know-It-All.
Yep.
Great.
That would be it.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Absolutely.
Can you stay on just for a couple minutes after I stop recording?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks a lot. All right.
See you.